Most people do not stay poor because they are lazy. They stay poor because they are loyal to a game that was never built to make them wealthy. That is the first thing I want to say. Not because hard work is worthless. It is not because discipline does not matter. It does. Not because character has no value. It absolutely does. But if your effort is being poured into the wrong game, then the reward you receive will match the structure of that game, not the purity of your intentions. That is what almost nobody is taught early enough. They are taught to optimize their behavior without ever being taught to inspect the board. They are told to become more reliable, more disciplined, more patient, more educated, more responsible, more obedient, more employable. And then when the outcome still looks disappointingly ordinary, they assume the problem must be inside them. Usually it is not. Usually the problem is that they became excellent at a game whose maximum prize was never real wealth in the first place. That is the mother line of everything I want to tell you. If you want to understand why so many intelligent and hardworking people still never build serious wealth, you have to stop looking only at their habits. You have to look at the game. What is being rewarded? What is being punished? What kind of behavior creates ownership? What kind of behavior merely creates usefulness? And who wrote the rules? Because once you ask those questions, a lot of modern financial life begins to look less like fair competition and more like guided traffic. The average person is not wandering randomly. He is being directed into school, directed into salary, directed into savings products, directed into retirement logic, directed into compliance, directed into a life where he is perpetually useful to someone else's balance sheet while being told he is building his own future. That is the script. And the script is powerful because it does not look cruel. It looks respectable. It looks mature. It looks responsible. It looks like the behavior good adults are supposed to perform. That is why it works so well. If exploitation came dressed like exploitation, people would resist it faster. But exploitation dressed as prudence can survive for generations. That is the game most people are still playing. And I think there are three false games that keep the majority trapped. The first is trading time for money as if labor were the natural path to wealth. The second is treating saving as if slow accumulation inside a diluted system were the same thing as capital formation. The third is believing the game is fundamentally fair and that if you simply follow the rules more obediently than everyone else, the system will eventually reward you with ownership. Those are the three losing games, and almost everybody is taught some version of all three. Now, let me tell you why they fail. The first wrong game is labor without leverage. This is the oldest trap in industrial society and the most socially praised. You are taught to become valuable, work hard, be dependable, show up early, stay late, get promoted, climb, accumulate years, accumulate praise, accumulate trust. And one day you are told all this will become wealth. It may become comfort, it may become status inside an organization, it may become a larger paycheck. What it rarely becomes by itself is real freedom, because labor has a hard ceiling built into it. No matter how smart you are, no matter how conscientious you are, no matter how many hours you give, your labor is still constrained by your body, your time, your energy, your field, the mood of your employer, the bargaining power of the labor market, and the fact that the asset being sold is you. That is the hidden fragility of the labor game. You are the engine, and if you are the engine, then the machine stops when you do. This is why I have always thought the phrase "work hard and you will succeed" was both true and dangerously incomplete. It is true in the sense that laziness is not a useful long-term strategy. It is incomplete, because hard work without ownership often just makes a person a more efficient servant of somebody else's asset base. The source document says this very directly. Poor people are taught to trade time for money, climb the corporate ladder, and treat salary as the path to wealth. Meanwhile, the people who actually got rich built around ownership, not labor. Fay file site, Fay turn 43 file 0 Fay. That is exactly the structural divide. Labor can generate income. Ownership generates claims, and claims are what become fortunes. A worker earns, spends, maybe saves, then repeats. An owner holds equity in a business, a piece of real estate, intellectual property, distribution rights, a brand, a platform, a legal claim, a productive asset. Those things continue to exist whether he is in a meeting, asleep, ill, traveling, or retired. They can throw off income without hourly attendance. They can appreciate, they can be financed against, they can be sold, they can be transferred, they can survive the day's fatigue. That is a completely different economic posture. Now, I do not say this to insult workers. I have enormous respect for disciplined work. Work is how most people begin. Work is how many people survive. Work is how people acquire skill, credibility, and the first pieces of surplus that later become capital. But work is a starting point. The problem is that the default script sells it as a destination. That is the lie. School prepares you to be evaluated. Employment prepares you to be scheduled. Performance reviews prepare you to be ranked. And the whole time you are praised for being valuable inside structures you do not own. That is why so many smart people end up with good resumes and weak balance sheets. They kept improving the wrong variable. They became easier to employ, not harder to replace. They became more polished labor, not more independent capital. That is the labor game in its cleanest form, useful, necessary, often honorable, but rarely transformative unless it is used as fuel for something else. Now let me tell you what the rich do differently, because the source is right that the real game begins with ownership. Not all ownership is glamorous. That is part of why people miss it. It is not always a tech company or some cinematic startup story. Sometimes it is a dull business with dependable margins. Sometimes it is a small equity stake in an operating company. Sometimes it is rental property bought soberly. Sometimes it is licensing rights. Sometimes it is a boring cash flow machine with no social prestige whatsoever. What matters is not the aesthetic of the asset. What matters is that the asset begins to separate income from immediate labor. That is the crucial threshold. The first hour of work pays your bills. The first owned asset begins training your life to move without asking your time for permission each minute. That is why I tell people to stop worshiping salary. Salary is useful, but it is still an exchange of life for money. It is better than chaos. It is not the same as wealth. Wealth begins when something you own starts paying you in a way not perfectly tied to your next hour. That is why the labor game can never be the full answer. Now, let us move to the second wrong game, because this one is even more socially praised and therefore even more dangerous. Saving without leverage. The default script says, this is responsibility, earn your wage. Be modest, put some aside, use the savings account. Contribute to the retirement wrapper, maybe buy broad indexes, wait 40 years, do not rock the boat, do not try anything strange, do not be greedy, do not be impatient. And one day you are told prudence will compound into security. There is some truth in this. A person who never saves is usually building future weakness. Cash reserves matter. Retirement contributions matter. Index funds can be a powerful tool for ordinary people. I do not deny any of that. But again, the problem is incompleteness. Saving is not the same thing as wealth strategy. Saving is preservation of surplus. Wealth strategy is multiplication of claims. Those are different things. The source says the poor are told to save and invest conservatively, while inflation, low returns, and delayed time horizons make it almost impossible for that behavior alone to catch up to those who own productive assets and use leverage. Fay file cite Fay turn 43 file 0 Fay. That is a hard sentence. It is also mostly true. A saver inside a system where inflation runs ahead of safe returns, where housing appreciates faster than wages, where tax treatment favors assets over salary, and where debt is made available to asset buyers on better terms than to ordinary consumers, is not playing the same game as the owner. The saver is moving linearly, the owner is moving geometrically, and linearity loses. This is one reason wealthy people do not despise debt the way the middle class is trained to despise it. They despise bad debt, they fear weak leverage, they avoid liabilities that fund consumption without return. But productive leverage is a completely different animal. The source makes this contrast in its own sharp way. Saving is for the poor, leverage is for the rich. That sentence is more provocative than I would normally say it. But the structure underneath it is important. The wealthy understand how to use other people's money, other people's time, and the legal structure of finance to amplify ownership. Fay file site Fay turn 43 file 0 Fay, that is the second real game, not saving alone. Leverage over saving. This does not mean debt is magical. Debt can kill you. It kills people every day. What matters is what the debt is attached to. Credit card debt for status consumption is poison. A loan funding productive capacity under the right terms can be a ladder. A mortgage on a well-bought rental asset can be a lever. An investor margining speculation at the top of a cycle may be insane. A business owner using a sensible credit line to fund profitable expansion may be acting rationally. This is why the slogan "debt is bad" is too simple to be useful. The rich are not richer because they never borrowed. They are often richer because they learn the difference between debt that extracts from the future and debt that recruits the future into paying for itself. That is a completely different mindset. The saver thinks, how much can I slowly preserve? The levered owner thinks, how can I control more productive value than my current cash alone would allow? Now, I want to be careful here because the public loves half-truths, and leverage is one of the easiest half-truths to misuse. You cannot simply copy the outer behavior of wealthy people and get the same result. Borrowing recklessly and calling it strategy is one of the fastest ways to ruin. The wealthy often have better terms, better legal advice, better timing, better fallback capital, and better information. Fine, that is real. But the principle still matters. If you never understand leverage, you remain trapped in a world where your only tools are discipline and delay. Those tools matter, but they are rarely enough to create large wealth by themselves. That is why I tell people to become students of financing, tax treatment, entity structure, depreciation, yield spread, cash flow mechanics, and downside asymmetry. Not because complexity is inherently noble, but because the wealthy have spent generations learning how to use the structure while ordinary people were taught only how to obey it. That is the true divide, not intelligence. Structural literacy. Now let us move to the third wrong game, because this one holds the whole system together emotionally: belief in fairness. Belief that the rules are mostly neutral. Belief that if you work hard, stay honest, follow the law, and behave responsibly, the system will eventually sort you into a higher position. The source is savage on this point. It argues that poor people stay trapped because they believe the system is fair, that meritocracy is real, and that following the rules will be rewarded, while elites understand the game is rigged and learn to use that reality. Fay site Fay turn 43 file 0 Fay again. The tone is angrier than mine would be, but the structural point deserves respect. The system is not purely fair. The legal system, tax system, education system, credit system, media system, and cultural reward system do not distribute outcomes with the neutrality implied by polite speeches. That does not mean all success is fake. It does not mean all wealth is theft. It does not mean effort never matters. It means effort is being processed through unequal machinery. That is very different. And once you understand that, the phrase "play fair" begins to sound less noble and more incomplete. If the wealthy use entity structures, deductions, lobbying, accountants, lawyers, negotiated financing, social influence, legal arbitrage, narrative management, and relationship networks to shape outcomes in their favor, then the person who believes fairness consists only in passive obedience is not morally superior. He is strategically disarmed. That is the third losing game. Not honesty, passivity disguised as honesty. The source says poor people cannot afford to break rules because the consequences are devastating, while rich people learn that rules are flexible if you have enough resources. Fay file site Fay turn 43 file 0 Fay. That is not universally true in every specific case, but directionally it captures something real about how power works. Law is not experienced equally. Tax enforcement is not experienced equally. Reputation damage is not experienced equally. Institutional forgiveness is not distributed equally. The poor person is often punished at the rule boundary. The rich person often negotiates at the rule boundary. That difference shapes mentality over time. One class is trained into caution, another into strategic boldness. One class hears rules as walls, another hears them as architecture. That is one reason social mobility feels harder than official ideology says it should. Now let me say something important, because I do not want this to collapse into nihilism. If you hear that the game is rigged and conclude, therefore nothing matters, you are still trapped. You have merely replaced naive obedience with theatrical despair. That is no improvement. The useful response is more serious. The useful response is to study where the system can be lawfully used, rerouted, minimized, arbitraged, or refused. That is where real wealth building begins. You do not have to break every rule. You should not. Many rules protect trust, property, and functioning society. What you must break are default assumptions. The assumption that school is always the best route. The assumption that a job is always safer than ownership. The assumption that all debt is bad. The assumption that saving slowly inside every conventional container is the same thing as building wealth. The assumption that asking permission is wiser than acting early. The assumption that the conventional path is neutral. Those are the rules that matter most, because they live inside the head. And once they live inside the head, the system no longer needs to police you very hard. You police yourself. That is how elegant systems of control work. Now I want to take the source S3 real games and translate them into something cleaner: ownership over labor. Leverage over saving, rigging the system in your favor instead of playing fair. Fine. Here is how I would say it. First, shift from selling hours to accumulating claims. That means asking of every major effort in your life, is this building only income, or is it building ownership? If the answer is only income for too many years in a row, then you are not moving toward wealth. You are just becoming a more polished labor seller. Second, shift from preservation to controlled amplification. That means learning when saving is appropriate, when investing is appropriate, when productive leverage is appropriate, and how to distinguish between debt that enslaves and debt that expands your claim on productive value. Third, shift from obedience to strategy. That means stop asking only what is respectable and start asking what is actually rewarded. It means learn taxes, learn entity structure, learn incentives. Learn where conventional advice is protecting you and where it is containing you. Learn who profits when you remain simple, visible, easily taxed, easily employed, and afraid of the tools owners use every day. That is the real education most people never receive. And yes, it takes time. The source does at least concede this in the final section. You do not just quit your job tomorrow and become wealthy by reciting the word ownership. You often need a long bridge period. Work the job, build on the side, buy the first small asset, learn slowly, delay gratification, build cash flow and literacy together. Fay file site Fayturn 43 file 0 Fay. That is one of the few places where the file becomes gentler and more realistic. And I think it matters because the transition from worker to owner is not usually one dramatic leap. It is often an ugly overlap. You work and build. You earn and learn. You stay tired longer than you want. You make boring sacrifices. You look less successful for a while than people who are consuming more freely. That is normal. The bridge is supposed to feel asymmetrical. You are trying to exit one game while still funding life inside it. That is not easy. But difficulty is not evidence the shift is wrong. It is often evidence the shift is real. Now, let me tell you what I think is the most dangerous sentence in the entire modern middle-class vocabulary. I am being responsible. Sometimes that sentence is wonderful. Sometimes it means a person is finally behaving like an adult, but sometimes it means something darker. Sometimes it means he is following the default script so faithfully that he never notices the script itself is not leading where he hopes. He takes the degree debt because it is responsible. He takes the stable job because it is responsible. He avoids learning finance because speculation sounds irresponsible. He keeps all surplus in low-yield channels because caution sounds responsible. He never asks whether the tax code can be structured around because compliance sounds responsible. He never starts the side business because it feels irresponsible. He never asks for more because modesty sounds responsible. And at the end of 20 years, he has a very coherent biography and a disappointingly fragile balance sheet. That is not responsibility. That is obedient drift. The wealthy do not always look more virtuous because they are more virtuous. Sometimes they look more effective because they were willing to be less obedient. That is a hard truth, but it is still true. Now let us talk about social approval. Because the source hints at this, but I think it deserves to be said more plainly, a great many people never build wealth because they are too dependent on being perceived as sensible by people who themselves are trapped. They fear looking strange, they fear the family judgment, they fear leaving the secure path, they fear being called greedy, arrogant, unrealistic, unstable, too ambitious, too unusual. This is one reason the default script has such power. It is socially reinforced by people who are also following it. The crowd protects the path because the path protects the crowd from having to question whether its own choices were sufficient. That means any real deviation feels like a moral criticism. It is not, but it will be read that way. This is why I tell people that part of wealth building is learning to survive social misunderstanding. Not everywhere, not recklessly, but enough to act before the room approves. Because by the time the room approves, the edge is usually gone. That is true in entrepreneurship, true in investing, true in career moves, true in asset buying, true almost everywhere. Permission comes late, strategy moves earlier. Now, I do not want to leave this in abstraction, so let me make it concrete. A person who spends 10 years increasing salary while never learning the tax code, never buying productive assets, never building anything on the side, never studying leverage, and never converting skill into ownership may be doing everything the culture praises. He may also be losing the game, a person who works a regular job, but studies asset ownership, buys a small business or small rental prudently, learns tax structuring, builds a side cash flow machine, and slowly shifts income into claims is doing something much closer to wealth building, even if his lifestyle appears less polished for a period. That is the difference. Not work versus laziness, game one versus game two. Now let me say something about fairness because I think this is where people become emotionally confused. You do not need to believe the world is perfectly fair to build in it. You do not need to become bitter to become strategic. You do not need to hate the wealthy to study what works. And you do not need to imitate the ugliest behaviors of elites in order to stop being economically naive. That is important. The source often speaks as if the choice is simply worker or elite, poor or rich, obedient or rule, breaker. Reality is more nuanced than that. A decent person can learn structure. A lawful person can learn arbitrage. An ethical person can learn ownership. A disciplined person can reject the default script without becoming predatory. That is exactly the path I would recommend. Do not become lawless, become literate. Do not become cynical, become strategic. Do not worship wealth, understand how it is built. Do not flatter the system. Learn where it rewards ownership more than effort and position yourself accordingly. That is the mature version of the message. Now let me pull the entire story together in the cleanest way I can. The poor stay poor, not only because they lack money, but because they are taught to play games whose highest reward is controlled survival. Trade time for money, save slowly. Trust fairness, that combination creates usefulness, not ownership. The wealthy, by contrast, build around a different logic. Own first, leverage carefully, study the rule book as architecture, not morality. That combination creates claims, scale, and options. The gap between the two is not simply talent, it is game selection. That is the real subject here, not wealth in the abstract game selection. And game selection begins in the mind long before it appears in the bank account. The moment a person stops asking only what is the respectable path and starts asking what path actually compounds control, claims, and future optionality for me, he has already stepped off the default script. That is where wealth begins, not at the $1 million mark, not at the first big win, at the first moment of strategic refusal. The refusal to keep being an excellent participant in a system that rewards your usefulness more reliably than your freedom. That is the turning point. So here is the final choice. You can keep treating the default script as neutral and spend your life getting better at labor, better at obedience, better at waiting, better at playing fair in structures that were not built to make fairness pay equally, or you can learn the harder truth. The world rewards ownership differently from labor. It rewards leverage differently from saving. It rewards strategy differently from obedience. Once you understand that, your job is not to become reckless. Your job is to become deliberate, to learn the actual game, to keep what protects you, to break what cages you, and to stop confusing social praise with financial progress. That is what becoming rich usually requires, not becoming a bad person. Becoming unwilling to live forever by a script whose highest purpose was to keep you useful, taxable, employable, and emotionally manageable, rather than meaningfully wealthy. That is the real break. And once it happens, the rest of your financial life begins to reorganize itself around a much more powerful question. Not how do I work harder inside the system, but how do I own more of what the system keeps rewarding? That is the right question, and it changes everything.